Bram Stoker's Dracula is one of the most famous and best regarded of Gothic novels. And in this Reader's Guide series, we're going to be taking a deep look at this famous story. We'll be taking a look at Bram Stoker's life and the plot of Dracula, and then we'll be digging deep into some of the key themes and characters of the story. We'll look at Dracula as a Gothic novel, putting it in a canon of great Gothic novels, starting with Anne Radcliffe and ending with Stephen King. We'll then explore themes of sexuality, sexual repression, and Victorian living in Dracula. We'll also look at homosexuality and how that plays into Dracula as a part of repressed sexuality. We'll also look at the characters, Mina and Lucy Westenra, two very different women representing very different ideals of womanhood and what that means. And we'll also look at Dracula himself, of course, and the vampires, the mythology, trying to understand what is it about vampires that is so compelling to us. There'll be 6 episodes in total of the whole series, and today we're going to be looking at Bram Stoker himself and the plot of Dracula. Bram Stoker was born on the 8th of November 1847 in Dublin, Ireland. His early childhood was plagued with weakness. He was unable to walk until he was 7 years old, though he would overcome this later in life, becoming an athlete and football player at Trinity College in Dublin. Writing wasn't immediately something that Stoker delved into as a career. In fact, he worked for 10 years as a member of the civil service and worked on the side as a drama critic for free. But he always did have a love of theatre, and through his job working on the side as a theatre critic, he was able to meet one of his heroes, the famous actor Sir Henry Ivering. The two had a very close friendship, and Stoker became Ivering's manager until his death 27 years later. In 1978, Stoker married a woman called Florence Balcombe, the daughter of a lieutenant. Balcombe was a celebrated beauty who was actually one of Oscar Wilde's proposed suitors, but that never happened. Stoker and Wilde maintained a very close friendship that continued even after Wilde was exiled for his homosexuality, with Stoker going to visit him during his exile. As for Stoker's marriage to Florence, while by all accounts it was a reasonably content one, it was also quite a sexless one, producing only one son. This, combined with some somewhat homoerotic letters that Stoker sent to one of his heroes, Walt Whitman, led some to speculate that Stoker was a repressed homosexual. Also, we have his friendship with Oscar Wilde as well here. Now, whether Stoker was bisexual, homosexual, or just not very into sex, we'll never know for sure, but certainly what we can say is that sexual repression is one of the big themes underlying Dracula, and something we'll be exploring in a lot of depth in later episodes. And just as Stoker used drama critique as a sideline, he also started to do this with literature as well. His first novel, called The Snake Pass, was published in 1890 when he was 33. Stoker was generally seen as pretty pragmatic as a writer. He did it just to make money on the side, and so it must have come as quite a surprise to him when he published Dracula, and it was quite a success, at least for the moment. As for the famous novel itself, there are several sources of inspiration that critics have speculated on. Stoker began to write Dracula during a visit to Cruden Bay in Scotland. The nearby castle, called Slains Castle, is thought to be the inspiration for Dracula's castle. In particular, the octagonal hall at Slains Castle matches the description of the octagonal room at Dracula's castle. Also, before writing his novel, Dracula met a man called Armin Vambery, a Hungarian Jewish writer and traveller, and Stoker was captured by Vambery's stories of Transylvania and vampires and the Carpathian Mountains. And of course, this led some to speculate that it was these stories that influenced the place, the location for Dracula, and perhaps some of the vampiric story that we get. Also, the scene in which the ship Demeter arrives on Whitby Bay washed ashore was actually based on a real event as well. A ship called Dimitri washed ashore at Whitby Bay, and investigators found a black dog that ran aground, running up the 199 steps from the Tate Sands beach into the graveyard of St Mary's Church, matching what happens very much in the story. Unfortunately, Stoker's success as a writer was somewhat short-lived, and his career and his life didn't end so well. His fortunes would begin changing in 1905. First, his friend Ivering died, and then his own health would begin to decline as he suffered a series of strokes that would continue for the rest of his life. Throughout his final years, Stoker lived battling this ill health and struggling to make money. Nevertheless, he did manage to complete 3 more novels in this time, 1 short story collection, and he was working on 2 further novels at the time of his death. And so even when things were bad at the end, he was still incredibly busy and incredibly creative. Nevertheless, Stoker died on April 20th in 1912 in relative obscurity. both because his death occurred 5 days after the sinking of the Titanic, and so this obviously was the major news story, but also because his reputation had dwindled somewhat. The furore caused by Dracula was short-lived, people had kind of forgotten about him. Even his obituary, which was buried on page 15 of the Times, focused mainly on his faithful service to Ivor and Irwin, as opposed to his novel. All we get about Stoker's writing is a kind of throwaway and not very nice comment about Stoker's penchant for particularly lurid and creepy kind of fiction. Obviously, time would change all of this. Although now very few people know of the famous actor, everyone now knows Dracula and Stoker and see him as writing one of the greatest Gothic novels of all time. Part 2. Dracula, a summary. So Dracula is presented to the reader as a collection of journal entries, letters, notes, telegrams, and even news clippings telling a story that changed the lives of the major characters. It opens with a character called Jonathan Harker, a young English solicitor recently engaged as he travels to Transylvania to secure a deal with a noble count, Dracula. Harker is to meet Dracula at his home to finalise a property transaction as Dracula is planning to move to England. Harker is your typical Victorian, industrialist, educated, middle-class man. He rejects superstition and champions reason and science, and so when he meets the Transylvanian people, it's only natural that he treats them with more than a little compassionate condescension, especially when they start heaping him with blessings and charms and warning him not to go to his intended destination, and often getting very afraid when he mentions where he's going. But as Jonathan travels through the Carpathian Mountains, where he has a horrifying run-in with a pack of wolves, along with some other strange experiences, the superstitions of these people even start to get under Jonathan's skin. Jonathan arrives at Castle Dracula and he meets the Count. The Count is a strange-looking man, deathly pale, dressed in a black cloak, with sharp teeth that make him look more wolf than man. At first, Harker takes the Count's strangeness to just be more foreign eccentricity. However, a few days later, he starts to become more afraid. First, Dracula lunges at Harker after he cuts himself shaving. The Count also makes strange warnings and requests of Harker while he's staying with him. He warns Harker not to go wandering about the castle at night, an order which he eventually disobeys. And when he does this, he finds himself in the clutches of 3 female vampires who seduce him and drain his blood. And then Dracula appears before these women, is very angry with them for attacking Jonathan, and the scene ends in a very gruesome scene in which Dracula feeds the 3 women a baby. Harker is abandoned in Castle Dracula soon after, and the Count, taking 50 crates of dirt with him, departs for England. Meanwhile, in England, we have Harker's fiancée Mina, a hard-working, ambitious woman who is visiting her close friend, a noblewoman called Lucy Westenra. Lucy has recently got herself engaged after declining a number of suitors. While things seem reasonably normal on the surface, several strange things start to happen to the 2 women, especially Lucy. First, Lucy takes up her old habit of sleepwalking. Then, a ship called the Demeter washes up on shore with all of the crew members dead and nothing but a black dog running ashore. Soon after this event, Lucy goes sleepwalking again, and Mina finds her out in the night being molested by a strange dark shape. Mina rescues Lucy and takes her home, only to discover that Lucy has 2 small pinprick holes on her throat. Soon after this, Lucy falls ill, and Mina calls on the help of Dr. Seward, who was one of the suitors that Lucy rejected, although he remains very faithful and loyal to Lucy. Unfortunately, Mina is called away from Lucy by a letter from a nunnery in Transylvania, telling her that her husband has escaped Castle Dracula and is seriously ill and needs her. Mina leaves Lucy to go to Transylvania, where she and Jonathan marry. Lucy, meanwhile, continues to battle her illness. Dr. Seward, confused and not knowing what is wrong with Lucy, calls on the help of his university teacher, the famous Dr. Van Helsing, who is not only a well-respected scientist, but is also a man who has an awareness of the occult. Van Helsing desperately tries to protect Lucy from Dracula, and after several false starts and attempts and failures, Lucy sadly succumbs and dies. Soon after Lucy's death, young children start reporting a woman called the Bloofer Lady, a woman in white who steals children in the night and leaves them in the morning with nothing but 2 pricks on their necks. Van Helsing chooses to reveal to Seward, along with Lucy's husband Arthur and their friend, the American Quinsy Morris, that Lucy is a vampire and that she is the Bloofer Lady reported by the children. In order to prevent her from killing any of these children, the men unearth her corpse, stake her through the heart, cut off her head, and stuff garlic in her mouth. Mina and Jonathan return to London sometime after this event and end up meeting Van Helsing. After sharing stories of their experiences, they come to believe that Count Dracula is responsible for Lucy's death, and they vow to stop him. Despite Mina's willingness to get involved and her ability to do so, the men exorcise her from their quest, leaving her alone while they begin to hunt Dracula alone, which they do by starting to destroy the 50 crates of earth that the Count has sequestered all across his London properties. Mina, meanwhile, spends her time gathering the various notes and putting them together. And she also spends a lot of time at Dr. Seward's asylum, where she befriends Renfield, a patient of Seward's who has a condition that he calls zoophagia, characterized as an obsession with drinking the blood of humans and animals. Renfield's behaviour becomes more erratic than usual during Mina's stay, and in an especially lucid moment, he tries to convince Dr. Seward and Van Helsing that he is sane and that he must leave at once. Sadly for him, he fails to convince them. Soon after Renfield's episode, Seward is awoken in the night with news that something terrible has happened to Renfield. He, Van Helsing, Quincy and Arthur Holmwood go to Renfield and find him in his cell with the back of his head smashed in. They learn that Dracula has done this, that Renfield has been under Dracula's spell the entire time, and that Dracula is currently attacking Mina. They race to Mina and Jonathan's bedroom, where they find Jonathan asleep in bed and Mina in a kind of trance, drinking the blood from Dracula's chest. After this horrific event, the men realise that they made a mistake to exclude Mina from their quest, and at last they come together to defeat Count Dracula. After destroying all but one of Dracula's boxes of earth, they force the Count to retreat back to Transylvania. Because Mina has drunk the blood of Dracula, she now has a psychic connection with the Count, which she reveals to the men, and they use her psychic connection to track the Count as he travels back to his home. As they approach the castle, the group splits up into pairs. Mina and Van Helsing travel together and reach the castle first, where they are attacked one evening by Dracula's 3 brides. Van Helsing dispatches them the following morning, and at the end of the novel, the party reunite for one final showdown with Dracula. Quincy Morris dies in the fight, but everyone else survives, and they are ultimately able to defeat the Count. Okay, so that is it for this summary of Dracula and Bram Stoker's life. Let me know down in the comments what you think of Dracula. Are there any particular things that you want me to focus on or discuss? I have scripted the series somewhat already, and some of the videos are recorded already, but if you have any thoughts or topics, I can certainly add in those into scripts that are finished, or even create new episodes for them as well. So let me know down in the comments if you have any thoughts along those lines. Otherwise, take care everyone. I'll see you all in the next episode. Ta-ra!